It was a quiet afternoon when I pulled into my driveway, tired from a long day of work. My mind was focused on the simple task of parking my car and heading inside to relax. Little did I know, this mundane action would set off a chain of events that would soon escalate into something out of control, involving the police and an angry neighbor. I had parked in my own driveway, something that should have been a completely normal thing to do. However, Karen, a neighbor who lived a few houses down, saw me and immediately began making assumptions about my intentions. I had barely turned off the engine when I saw her storming out of her front door, pointing directly at me as she marched across her lawn. It wasn't unusual for Karen to be vocal about her opinions, but today, something felt different. The look on her face was one I hadn't seen before, one that clearly showed she was determined to escalate a situation that didn't need any escalation. I ignored her at first, thinking she'd just grumble to herself, as she often did when she disapproved of anything around her. But Karen wasn't the type to let things go. As I was gathering my things from the passenger seat, I heard her voice, sharp and frantic, as she shouted over to me. "You can't park there," she yelled. "It's blocking the street. You're causing a disturbance." The words seemed ridiculous, and I wasn't sure if she was even serious. My driveway was, in fact, my property, and the car I was parking had more than enough space. I tried to ignore her, thinking she'd eventually go back inside, but Karen was persistent. She started pacing in front of my driveway, her movements agitated, as if waiting for a reaction. I was growing increasingly frustrated but tried to remain calm, not wanting to give her any more reason to cause trouble. The next thing I knew, I heard her voice again, but this time, it was different. It was trembling with anger, and she was speaking to someone on the phone. "Yes, I need the police here immediately," she shouted. "There's someone parked in their own driveway, and they're causing a disturbance. They won't leave." I couldn't believe it. Karen had actually called the cops over something as trivial as me parking in my own space. My mind raced, trying to process how she could make such a big deal out of something so insignificant. The absurdity of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. This woman, who couldn't seem to mind her own business, was now bringing the law into a situation that didn't even remotely warrant it. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just some petty argument. Karen was escalating things to a whole new level, and I had no idea what she was planning to do next. What would she say to the police? Would they believe her wild accusations? As I stood there, frozen in disbelief, I realized I was in for a confrontation that could potentially go far beyond what I had imagined. The worst part? She seemed determined to make this a problem that wasn't going to just go away with a simple apology or explanation. No, Karen was ready to turn this into a full-blown spectacle, and I had a feeling she wasn't about to back down easily. I stood there, watching Karen pace in front of my driveway, as her phone call to the police continued. Every time she glanced back at me, I could see the satisfaction on her face, as if she thought she was in control of the situation. It made my blood boil, but I knew the last thing I should do was engage with her directly. I had dealt with Karen before. Her tendency to stir up unnecessary drama was well known in the neighborhood. But this time felt different. There was something about the intensity in her eyes that told me she wasn't just upset about parking in front of her house. She had decided that today, she was going to make me pay for something that I hadn't even done. I had never imagined that something as mundane as parking in my own driveway would trigger such a chain reaction. As the seconds ticked by, I could feel the tension in the air, thickening with every passing moment. I tried to remain calm, breathing deeply, but it wasn't easy. I glanced at my car, realizing that even though I had parked it legally, it was no use trying to reason with Karen. She had already decided that I was in the wrong. Her mind was made up, and she was not going to let go of this without a fight. I looked around, considering my options, but there wasn't much I could do except wait for the police to arrive. As time passed, my frustration grew. Why was Karen doing this? What had I done to provoke such a ridiculous response from her? I had lived in this neighborhood for years without any issues, and suddenly, over a simple parking decision, I was now the target of her fury. It didn't make sense. But as I continued to observe her from the corner of my eye, I realized that Karen wasn't just mad about the parking. There was something more to it, some deeper issue that had triggered her need to control and manipulate the situation. Maybe it was the fact that I had no idea who she thought she was to dictate where I could park on my property. Or perhaps it was the simple fact that she couldn't tolerate anyone defying her sense of authority. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. As I continued to stand there, watching Karen, I noticed her behavior getting more erratic. She was pacing faster now, her arms flailing about as she spoke to the dispatcher on the other end of the line. She was over-exaggerating the situation, making it sound like I had parked in the middle of the street, blocking traffic, or even causing some kind of emergency. In reality, my car was neatly parked in my driveway, well within the boundaries of my property. There was no obstruction to traffic, and certainly no danger to anyone. Yet Karen's voice grew louder with every word, and her urgency seemed to increase. The absurdity of it all was almost too much to bear. I could feel my anger building, but I knew that getting into a confrontation with her would only make things worse. Instead, I stayed where I was, observing her as she continued to escalate things. I wondered how long it would take for the police to arrive. Would they take her seriously? Would they even bother to check the facts before making a judgment? Or would they just show up, hear Karen's version of events, and decide that I was at fault without even bothering to look into the situation? I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew that whatever happened next, I had to be ready to stand my ground. I had nothing to hide. I had done nothing wrong. I had parked in my driveway, like I had done 1,000 times before. The fact that Karen had chosen this particular moment to make an issue of it was baffling to me. As I stood there, stewing in my frustration, I noticed that my neighbors across the street had begun to gather. They were curious, no doubt wondering what the commotion was all about. Some of them waved at me, but I could see the looks of confusion on their faces as they tried to piece together the situation. They were probably used to Karen's antics by now. After all, she had a reputation in the neighborhood for causing trouble, especially when it came to petty matters like parking, noise, and even people's choice of lawn decorations. But what I didn't expect was for Karen to suddenly stop pacing and stand still, her eyes locked onto mine. She had finally noticed that I wasn't going to back down. She glared at me, her lips curling into a smirk. The satisfaction on her face was unsettling, as if she were savoring the idea of having the police show up and teach me a lesson. I could feel her gaze burning into me, and for a moment, it felt as though she was daring me to make a move. But I didn't flinch. I remained calm, keeping my distance. The only thing that mattered was the outcome of this situation. Minutes later, I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and anticipation. This was it. The police were on their way, and soon I would find out how they would handle this absurd situation. Would they take Karen's side and ask me to move my car, or would they see through her theatrics and realize that this was all just a misunderstanding? Either way, I had to be prepared. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I wasn't the one in the wrong here. I had every right to park in my own driveway. As the police car finally came into view, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. There was no turning back now. Karen was standing rigidly on the sidewalk, her posture tense, her eyes still fixed on me with a sense of self-righteous anger. The officers pulled up in front of my house, their car's lights flashing briefly before they turned them off. 2 officers got out, their expressions neutral, yet alert. I could see they were already sizing up the situation, clearly trying to figure out what had led to this call. The first officer, a man in his 30s, glanced at me and then at Karen, who immediately started talking, loudly and with all the drama she could muster. "This person is causing a huge disturbance," she said, gesturing toward me. "They're blocking the street, and they won't leave. I've asked them to move, and they refuse. This has been going on for too long." Her voice was laced with a mix of frustration and triumph, as if she believed the police would instantly back her up. But the officer didn't seem impressed. Instead, he turned to Karen and asked, "Where exactly is the disturbance?" He glanced at my car parked in the driveway and raised an eyebrow. It was clear that this wasn't what he had expected when he had received the call. The second officer, a woman who appeared to be in her 40s, stood silently, observing both Karen and me. She wasn't making any immediate judgments, but her stern look told me she was taking the situation seriously. I felt a flicker of hope. The officers were already starting to question Karen's version of events. This was going to be interesting. The officers exchanged glances, and it quickly became clear that they weren't going to take Karen's accusations at face value. The first officer, after observing the situation for a moment longer, turned to Karen with a calm but firm tone. He asked her to explain exactly how my parking in my own driveway had disrupted the neighborhood. Karen, of course, went on and on about how someone could have been in danger, and how no one was able to get by despite the fact that there was plenty of room for cars to pass by. It was as though she was building a case out of thin air, fabricating reasons to make herself seem like the victim in this whole ordeal. As she ranted, I couldn't help but notice the growing disbelief on the officers' faces. They were no longer paying much attention to Karen's words. Instead, their focus shifted to the facts. The situation was straightforward, and there was no sign of any actual disturbance. My car was parked neatly in my driveway, and there was no obstruction on the street. I stood off to the side, watching the interaction unfold, but I wasn't about to interfere. The officers were doing their job, and I knew that the truth was on my side. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to be growing more agitated by the minute. She was practically trembling, her face flushed with anger, but the more she spoke, the more it became apparent that her story was full of holes. The first officer glanced back at me, and I could see the faintest hint of skepticism in his eyes, as if he was starting to put two and two together. He asked me a few basic questions: whether I was blocking anyone's driveway, if there was a situation involving the street, and if I had any reason to believe I was doing something wrong. I calmly answered each question, making sure to emphasize that I had parked my car legally in my own driveway and that there was no issue with the street or traffic flow. The second officer, who had remained silent until now, nodded approvingly. She looked at her partner and gave him a small but meaningful gesture, almost as if silently signaling that they both agreed this was becoming a ridiculous situation. Despite the mounting evidence that Karen's claims didn't hold up, she refused to back down. She continued to argue, her voice rising in pitch and volume, as though trying to convince herself more than the officers. She began to exaggerate further, accusing me of being a nuisance and creating problems for everyone in the neighborhood. Her words became more disconnected from reality, and I could see the officers exchanging another glance. It was clear they were no longer taking her seriously. The first officer finally interrupted her, his voice calm but authoritative. He told her that, based on the facts, there was no reason to involve the police in this matter any further. He emphasized that parking in one's own driveway was perfectly legal, and there was no disturbance caused to anyone on the street. Karen, however, was not done. She demanded to speak with a supervisor, insisting that the officers were missing something or failing to understand the gravity of the situation. It was as though she had built up this entire narrative in her mind, and she wasn't about to let go of it without a fight. At that moment, I felt a mixture of relief and frustration. It was obvious that the officers were not going to entertain Karen's increasingly outrageous demands, but the fact that she was so determined to drag this on felt exhausting. I had never expected my simple act of parking in my own driveway to result in a confrontation with the police, let alone have a neighbor escalate the situation to this degree. The officers, showing remarkable patience, explained to Karen once again that they could not act on her complaints because there was no legitimate issue here. They assured her that if she had further concerns, she could follow the proper legal channels, but that there was no crime being committed at this moment. Karen's face reddened, and she clenched her fists, clearly frustrated. Her eyes flicked between the officers and me, her sense of control slipping away with each passing second. It was almost as if she had hoped that by involving the police, she would somehow have the power to force me into submission. But the officers were not swayed by her theatrics. It was becoming clear that Karen's efforts were futile, and her story was falling apart at the seams. As the officers began to wrap up the situation, Karen finally went silent. She stood there, glaring at me with a mixture of resentment and disbelief, her mouth pressed into a thin line. The second officer turned to me and gave me a small nod, signaling that the matter was effectively resolved. She then addressed Karen one last time, telling her that the situation was over and that she should consider moving on. The officers got back into their patrol car, and I could hear the sound of the engine as they slowly drove away. For a moment, there was a silence between Karen and me, one that felt thick with unspoken tension. She was no longer ranting or accusing me of anything. Instead, she simply stood there, glaring at me with an expression that seemed to suggest this wasn't over in her mind. I could tell that Karen wasn't used to being challenged, let alone proven wrong. But the fact remained that I had done nothing wrong. I had parked in my own driveway, and I had every right to do so. As the officer's car disappeared around the corner, Karen finally turned on her heel and marched back to her house. Her steps were heavy, and her posture was stiff with frustration. I knew that she wasn't about to let this go, not entirely. There would likely be more drama to come. But for now, the situation was over. I could finally breathe a sigh of relief. I returned to my car and pulled into the garage, taking a moment to reflect on what had just transpired. How had something so trivial escalated to this point? The whole ordeal seemed surreal, and I couldn't help but wonder how long Karen had been waiting for an opportunity like this to make trouble. But at the end of the day, it was clear that I had come out on top. Karen had failed to get her way, and I had been proven right. This entire incident had been a ridiculous waste of time, but it had also taught me something important. Not everyone would let things go, no matter how unreasonable their complaints might be. Sometimes, you just had to stand your ground and let the truth speak for itself. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the street, I sat in my living room, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The events of the afternoon had left me drained, both physically and emotionally. I had never imagined that a simple act like parking in my own driveway would set off such a chaotic series of events. Yet, here I was, still processing everything that had happened. Karen's dramatic display, the police intervention, and the tension that lingered in the air all seemed so surreal. It was hard to believe that a matter as trivial as parking had caused such an uproar. I couldn't help but replay the scene in my mind, from Karen's frantic phone call to the officer's cool, collected responses. It felt like a scene from a bizarre movie, one where the protagonist is forced to deal with an overzealous antagonist whose grip on reality is tenuous at best. I was left to wonder why Karen had even bothered to escalate things to this point. Why had she chosen to involve the police in something so insignificant? Was it her need to feel in control, or was there something deeper that I wasn't seeing? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Karen's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't the first time she had caused trouble in the neighborhood, nor would it likely be the last. Over the years, I had heard countless stories from other neighbors about her petty grievances, complaints about noise, complaints about yard decorations, even complaints about how people parked in front of their own houses. It seemed that Karen's sense of entitlement knew no bounds. She felt as though she could dictate how others lived their lives, and anyone who disagreed with her was an enemy to be dealt with. I couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration at how this woman had managed to turn such a harmless situation into something so dramatic. But at the same time, I also realized that I couldn't let her win. This had been her attempt to impose her will on me, to make me feel small, and to turn something as mundane as parking into a spectacle of her own making. She had wanted to make me out to be the villain, to make it seem like I was causing a disturbance when, in reality, I had done nothing wrong. It was clear that Karen thrived on drama, on the power of being able to make others uncomfortable. But what she didn't realize was that people were starting to see through her antics. The neighbors who had gathered outside during the confrontation had seen the absurdity of the situation firsthand. They had watched as Karen tried to turn something trivial into a crisis, and they knew exactly what she was trying to do. I could sense their silent judgment as they observed the scene unfold, and I felt a small sense of victory in knowing that they were no longer as easily swayed by her manipulations. Karen had tried to rally the support of the police, but in the end, her own exaggerations had done more harm than good. The officers saw through her, and they had made it clear that her behavior was unacceptable. That was a small win, but it felt significant. It was a reminder that no matter how much someone tried to bend the truth always had a way of coming to light. As I sat there, I couldn't help but wonder what would come next. Would Karen continue to cause trouble, or would this serve as a wake-up call for her? I wasn't sure. The type of person Karen was didn't seem the type to easily back down. She had a need for control that ran deep, and that need would likely drive her to find another way to disrupt the peace. I had a feeling this wasn't the last I'd see of her, but for now, I was grateful that the situation had been resolved. It was one thing to deal with a neighbor who had minor complaints, it was another to have someone take it to the extreme, as Karen had done. Still, I couldn't help but feel a certain amount of unease. What if she tried something like this again, only this time with a different issue? The possibility that this wouldn't be the end of her interference lingered in the back of my mind. But then again, what could she really do? The officers had made it clear that her complaint had no merit, and the neighbors had seen firsthand how exaggerated her version of events was. In a way, the whole situation had backfired on Karen. She had tried to make a spectacle of my actions, but instead, she had only succeeded in embarrassing herself. Her credibility had taken a hit, and I could only hope that the people around her would begin to realize that she wasn't someone to be taken seriously. I thought back to the moment when the police had intervened, their calm professionalism standing in stark contrast to Karen's over-the-top behavior. I had never felt more vindicated than when the officers had dismissed her claims, and I could only imagine how she must have felt in that moment. She had come in with a sense of entitlement, expecting the situation to go her way, but in the end, the truth had prevailed. I tried to push the lingering thoughts aside as I prepared for the evening. I needed to clear my mind and focus on something other than Karen's theatrics. I made myself dinner, the simple routine helping to calm my nerves. But even as I ate, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Karen's obsession with control was unnerving, and the fact that she had been so willing to drag the police into a petty dispute was a reminder of the lengths she was willing to go to get her way. What was truly concerning was that there were likely other people in the neighborhood who weren't as fortunate as I had been, people who might not have had the support of the police or other neighbors to back them up. I wondered how many other times Karen had tried to manipulate situations to her advantage, forcing others to comply with her demands. It wasn't just about parking or noise or petty disagreements, it was about power, about the ability to make others bend to her will. As I reflected on the afternoon's events, I realized that this experience had taught me something valuable. It had reminded me of the importance of standing my ground, of not letting someone like Karen push me around. It had also shown me the importance of relying on the truth, even when others tried to distort it. I had done nothing wrong. I had parked my car in my own driveway, and I had every right to do so. Karen, on the other hand, had let her imagination run wild, creating problems where none existed. In the end, the truth had prevailed, and I had come out on top. But it wasn't just about winning, it was about maintaining my integrity and not allowing someone else's need for control to dictate my actions. As the evening drew to a close, I felt a sense of peace settling over me. I had dealt with Karen, and I had emerged victorious. The police had seen through her lies, and the neighbors had witnessed the absurdity of the situation firsthand. For now, I was free from her interference. But I knew that I had to remain vigilant. Karen was not the type to back down easily, and I had a feeling she would find another way to make her presence known. When that time came, I would be ready. Until then, I would enjoy the quiet of my home, knowing that I had stood up for myself and proved that I would not let anyone, no matter how entitled they may be, dictate how I lived my life. The following days passed in a strange, uneasy quiet. Karen had not approached me again, nor had she caused any further disruptions, at least not in the immediate aftermath of the incident. However, I knew better than to assume that everything was resolved for good. The experience had taught me a lot about the kind of person Karen was, someone who thrived on drama and conflict, someone who believed the rules didn't apply to her, and most troubling of all, someone who was willing to manipulate any situation to get her way. As much as I hoped this would be the last time I had to deal with her, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be. In fact, I had a growing sense that this confrontation might have been just the beginning of something larger. It wasn't just Karen's need for control that troubled me, it was the way she seemed to relish causing trouble in the community. Her behavior wasn't isolated. It was a pattern that had been going on for years. I began to wonder how many other neighbors had been subjected to her petty complaints or her attempts to control their behavior. I thought back to the small, seemingly insignificant interactions I had witnessed over the years, loud arguments over lawn decorations, accusations about noise levels that were far from disruptive, and the way she would always try to get her way, no matter how unreasonable her demands were. Karen seemed to be the type of person who couldn't stand it when things didn't go according to her plan. That made me wonder if the police had dealt with her before. Had they responded to other calls that were just as absurd as the one she'd made against me? It wasn't hard to imagine her calling the authorities over something else trivial, perhaps a neighbor's tree hanging slightly over the property line or a car parked a few inches too far to the left in someone's own driveway. The thought of it frustrated me. I had seen firsthand how easily Karen could manipulate the situation, bending the truth until it fit her narrative. If she could do that with me, what about others who might not be as confident or as prepared to stand up to her? I began to feel a deep sense of unease, realizing that Karen wasn't just a nuisance to me, she was a problem for the whole neighborhood. Still, for the moment, I had to focus on what was in front of me. The incident had already become a distant memory for most of the neighbors, who had quickly moved on after the police left. I couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything that had happened, Karen had been allowed to slip by unscathed. No one had really called her out for her behavior, and no one had questioned the disruptive role she played in our small community. As much as I wanted to forget the whole thing and get back to my routine, I found myself thinking about Karen more and more. What was her endgame? What would she try next? It wasn't long before I began to notice subtle shifts in the way the other neighbors interacted with Karen. In the weeks following the parking incident, several of them seemed to keep their distance from her, more so than usual. There was a coldness in the air whenever she passed by, as if everyone had suddenly become aware of the reality behind her mask of authority and righteousness. No one outright confronted her, but there was a growing sense that Karen had lost some of the respect she once held in the neighborhood. That was, in a way, a victory. The truth had come out, and Karen's desperate need to control everything had been exposed for what it truly was, an attempt to bully and manipulate her way through life. I couldn't help but feel a bit of satisfaction in knowing that she had been exposed. It wasn't about revenge or making her pay for what she'd done, but it was about justice. I had stood my ground, and the police had sided with me, as they should have. The other neighbors had witnessed her behavior, and they had seen that her accusations were baseless. In a strange way, Karen had done the community a favor by showing everyone just how far she would go to impose her will on others. She had become a cautionary tale, and while she might not have realized it, she had effectively alienated herself from the people around her. Despite this, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Karen's behavior would escalate again. People like her didn't just change overnight. I knew that she would find another way to make trouble, another opportunity to assert her dominance, and another neighbor to pick on. I started paying more attention to the small interactions around the neighborhood, waiting for the moment when Karen would once again stir the pot. It was inevitable, after all. People like her never truly back down. They just regroup, take a step back, and wait for the next opportunity to push their agenda. It was during one of these moments of vigilance that I caught a glimpse of something that confirmed my suspicions. A few weeks after the parking incident, I saw Karen standing on her front porch, talking animatedly with another neighbor. It was the same neighbor who had lived across the street from me for years, and I knew he had always been one to avoid conflict. He was the type of person who kept to himself, never got involved in neighborhood disputes, and generally tried to stay out of everyone's way. But there he was, standing on his porch, listening to Karen as she gestured wildly with her hands. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see the uncomfortable body language from the other neighbor. He was backing away slowly, as though trying to distance himself from whatever Karen was saying. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Karen was likely complaining about something trivial again, trying to drag someone else into her web of control. I knew I had to stay vigilant. Karen wasn't going to stop, and I couldn't afford to let my guard down. The reality was that someone had to be prepared to stand up to her, to call out her nonsense when it came time to do so. She wouldn't change unless someone stood firm and made it clear that her behavior wasn't acceptable. The situation with the police had shown me that even people like Karen couldn't get away with everything if the truth was on your side. But it also made me realize that we, as a community, had to be ready to deal with Karen together. If we all stood up to her when the time came, she would no longer be able to manipulate and control the people around her. I couldn't help but think about the ways I could help others who might find themselves in Karen's crosshairs. If she targeted anyone else the way she had targeted me, I would be ready. I had been through it already, I knew how she operated, and I knew how to stand my ground. It was a lesson I'd learned the hard way, but it was one that had given me the strength to confront her without fear. As much as I wanted to move past the situation and go back to my life, I knew that Karen's presence would continue to loom over the neighborhood until someone called her out for what she was. She wouldn't stop until she felt she had full control, and that was something I couldn't let happen. I was more determined than ever to stand my ground and be ready for whatever came next. And as much as I hoped it wouldn't be necessary, I knew that when the time came, I would be ready to face Karen once again. Only this time, I wouldn't be alone. The whole neighborhood would be watching. Weeks passed in relative peace after that tense encounter with Karen and the police, but the calm was deceptive. While the neighborhood seemed to have returned to normal, a low undercurrent of tension remained, one that I couldn't shake off. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself glancing around, wondering if today would be the day Karen would cause another scene. The small, subtle shifts I had noticed in the behavior of my neighbors were enough to make me think that Karen's reputation had taken a significant hit. However, I knew better than to assume that she would back down quietly. People like Karen didn't change, they only adapted. They learned from their mistakes, yes, but only in the sense that they found new, more cunning ways to continue their manipulations. It was clear to me now that Karen had a deep need for control, and the events of the past few weeks had shown her that her usual tactics weren't going to work on everyone. But she hadn't given up. If anything, it only seemed to fuel her desire to reclaim her sense of authority. It wasn't long before Karen's latest scheme began to unfold, though I didn't realize it at first. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I noticed her standing at the end of her driveway, scribbling something down on a notepad. Her expression was focused, as if she were deep in thought, but I didn't give it much attention. I had enough on my plate without worrying about her latest antics. However, as I drove past her house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She was still standing there, now appearing to measure something along the edge of her property with a tape measure. The oddness of it struck me, but I couldn't figure out what she was up to. It wasn't until the following week that I learned exactly what Karen had been planning. One evening, as I was getting my mail, I overheard two of my neighbors discussing a letter they had received from Karen. It was something that she had apparently handed out to everyone in the cul-de-sac. The letter was official-looking, almost like a formal complaint, and it detailed what she believed to be violations of neighborhood rules, specifically regarding property lines and encroachments. Karen had gone around measuring the yards, comparing fence lines, hedges, and even the placement of garbage bins, claiming that some properties were infringing upon her land. She had written in her letter that she was officially requesting that everyone adjust their property lines and make changes to their yards to bring them into compliance with what she deemed the appropriate standards. The letter was absurd, of course. Most of the complaints were about things that had been there for years, things that no one had ever even thought twice about. But Karen had made it clear that she wasn't going to let it slide anymore. She was demanding that the neighborhood comply with her standards, or face some kind of legal action. I was furious when I found out. It wasn't enough for Karen to create chaos in the neighborhood once, now she was trying to force everyone to conform to her personal rules, to live under her thumb. What bothered me even more was the fact that she had gone behind people's backs to create this whole mess. Rather than addressing her concerns openly, she had covertly gathered evidence, measuring and documenting things, as if she were a neighborhood sheriff. I couldn't believe that she had the gall to pull something like this again, especially after everything that had already happened. But there was something in the way the neighbors were talking that made me realize I wasn't the only one who felt this way. It wasn't just me who was fed up with Karen's overstepping. It seemed that the whole neighborhood was beginning to see her for what she truly was, a self-appointed authority figure with no real authority. This time, I wasn't going to let Karen's antics slide. I wasn't about to allow her to get away with this new round of manipulation. I started talking to more neighbors about the letter they had received, and as I expected, most of them were just as annoyed and frustrated as I was. Some of them had already ignored her demands, dismissing them as ridiculous, but there were a few who were genuinely concerned. The idea of facing legal action, even over something as trivial as a fence or a shrub, was enough to make anyone anxious. And Karen knew that. She knew that the best way to get people to comply with her unreasonable demands was to make them fear the consequences. She had once again used fear as a weapon, trying to bully the neighborhood into doing what she wanted. But this time, things would be different. I wasn't about to let her continue her reign of manipulation. I decided to take action, starting with organizing a meeting with the other neighbors. It wasn't much, but it was the first step in making sure Karen knew that she wouldn't be able to control everyone any longer. I invited as many people as I could, making sure to include those who had already been targeted by Karen's letter. When the meeting day came, I wasn't sure what to expect. I had no idea how the neighbors would react to the idea of standing up to Karen, or if they would even take me seriously. But as the group gathered in my living room, I could feel a shift in the air. There was an energy in the room, a collective sense of frustration and disbelief that we had allowed things to get this far. As we began discussing the situation, it became clear that I wasn't the only one who felt that Karen had crossed a line. The neighbors who had received her letter were all equally upset, but what struck me was the realization that no one had ever really confronted her directly before. It was as though everyone had been too afraid to stand up to her, or had simply hoped that she would eventually tire of her antics. But the truth was, Karen had only grown bolder. She had pushed her way into every corner of the neighborhood, trying to impose her will on everyone she came into contact with. It was time for that to end. We agreed to take collective action, to write a letter to Karen, stating that her demands were not only unreasonable but also unwarranted. We would make it clear that the neighborhood would no longer tolerate her interference in our personal lives. The letter would also remind her that there were local regulations and zoning laws in place, and that if she wanted to continue her crusade, she would have to go through the proper channels. Karen's behavior was no longer just an inconvenience, it was a disruption to the peace of the community, and it was time someone called her out on it. I felt a sense of resolve settle over me as we worked on the letter together. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood standing up to Karen's sense of entitlement. For the first time in a long while, I felt confident that we could finally put an end to her reign of chaos. And when the letter was ready, I knew exactly what I had to do next. I was done being a passive observer to Karen's manipulations. It was time to take control of the situation, once and for all. This time, Karen wasn't going to win. We finished drafting the letter, making sure to include everything we wanted to communicate clearly and firmly. The tone was polite but unyielding, emphasizing that Karen's actions were both unjustified and disruptive to the neighborhood. We also made sure to include references to local laws and ordinances, ensuring that Karen understood that her actions could have consequences if she tried to escalate things further. It was a well-crafted response, designed to put an end to her behavior once and for all. Once the letter was finalized, we decided that it was best to present it in person. We didn't want Karen to dismiss it as just another piece of mail. This needed to be delivered with the full weight of our collective dissatisfaction behind it. The day we went to deliver the letter was a moment of quiet determination. We gathered in front of Karen's house, a small but unified group of neighbors, each of us feeling the tension of what was about to happen. It wasn't just about standing up to Karen anymore, it was about reclaiming our neighborhood from her influence. I could feel the support of my neighbors, the sense that we were doing something important, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who had been subjected to Karen's petty demands over the years. We walked up to her front door, the letter in hand, ready to confront her once and for all. When Karen answered the door, her usual smug expression faltered for just a moment. She had been expecting more of the same, someone to back down, to apologize, to give in to her manipulations. But this time, there was no backing down. There was no apology. There was only the truth and a collective resolve. We handed her the letter, and without a word, turned and walked away. There was no need for confrontation, the message had been delivered. Karen didn't try to stop us. She didn't say anything. It was as though, for the first time in a long while, she realized that her control over the neighborhood was slipping away. In the days that followed, Karen didn't make any more attempts to challenge the neighborhood. No more letters, no more complaints. She had been silenced, and the community had come together to ensure that she understood she couldn't dictate the lives of others. It was a quiet victory, but it was a powerful one. For the first time, Karen was forced to recognize that her actions had consequences, and that the people around her weren't going to stand by and let her cause trouble without consequence. As time went on, things in the neighborhood gradually returned to a peaceful state. The atmosphere had shifted. The constant tension that had once hung in the air was now gone, replaced by a sense of calm. People were once again able to go about their daily lives without the fear of being harassed by Karen over something trivial. The sense of solidarity among the neighbors remained, and we all knew that if Karen ever tried something like this again, we would be ready. For me, it was more than just about Karen. It was a reminder of the power of community, of how standing together could make a difference. It showed me that even the most entitled and controlling individuals could be stopped when people banded together with a shared purpose. And while Karen had lost this round, I knew that she would always be the kind of person who would continue to look for ways to control others. But as long as we remained united, we would be ready to face whatever came next. And so, life slowly returned to normal. The memory of the confrontation began to fade, but the lessons it had taught us remained. We had learned that no one should ever be allowed to dictate how others live, and that standing up for what's right, no matter how small the issue, could have a lasting impact. The power of a united neighborhood had triumphed, and Karen had learned, perhaps for the first time, that her manipulations would no longer have the desired effect. It was a hard-fought victory, but it was one that was well worth it.